Okay, chapter 10 is continues the notion of specific demographic variables regarding what constitutes difference at work, and the emphasis in this chapter is predominantly on race and sexuality. So, as always, here are your chapter objectives listed, and they're fairly straightforward. First of all, the textbook defines, or the chapter offers you a definition of difference. And again, it has that bit of a socially constructed meaning, a socially constructed reality, and looks at it within the context of power, again, consistent with that critical perspective. So it's important to understand that it contrasts with what is defined as normal, and normal is often defined as what has been the norm historically. Not right or wrong, there's no valence, it's simply not no value, but rather that it has been predominantly XYZ, and so now all of a sudden I've got a P, how does that fit in with XYZ? And looking at it from the framework of precedent. Okay, so other issues within this chapter, looking at the first perspective on this, where it really dives in, or the real narrows down, is the notion of race and organizational communication. So again, race is the first difference that is explored within this chapter. Giving you a little of historical background on this, certainly you can see from the PowerPoint and the chapter itself where studies of race within organizations have gone and the issues that they have explored in terms of inclusion, exclusion, and so on and so forth. In terms of the current contemporary workplace, away from that historical point of view, a lot of the emphasis here is on the notion of managing diversity, which is a bit of a problem for some researchers and some scholars, because they argue if your emphasis is simply how to manage diversity, you're really only looking at diversity as another variable to be manipulated, and that is an impersonal point of view. And they rather say that it is better to look at a race as an organizational issue rather than simply as a minority issue. Okay, so here we have power relations and how they work in concert with communication strategies. And there are examples of different theories that are used to illustrate this particular point in the textbook. The notion of interrogating whiteness, this comes predominantly from Peggy McIntosh, who wrote an article called Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. Very, very thought-provoking article. Recommend that you Google it. I'm sure that you can find it online. It was written several decades ago. She caused quite a lot of waves by it, and it's amazing. I still use it in my culture classes and in a variety of different classes that I teach. And the debates amongst students provoked by this particular article are very enlightening. It'd be great for getting you to think about things you have not thought about. A lot of that is this notion of whiteness, this idea that there are institutionalized practices, things that people have engaged in, that they participate both consciously and unconsciously. Okay. The second big issue looked at in this chapter on difference beyond race is the notion of sexuality. So some of you may be wondering, why are we looking at this? Why is this relevant? And yet it has many ramifications within the organization, both on a personal level and micro level and on the macro organizational level. As your textbook argues, there are certain organizations that will specifically, very obviously articulate and attempt to manipulate sexuality in terms of behavior. And your book makes the argument, organizations are full of sexuality. Part of wherever there are people, this is a notion that's going to exist. So in terms of 3 ways to look at organizational sexuality, this instrumental use is the first one. And with this, you're basically looking at how sexuality is utilized. When people use that adjective instrumental, it's predominantly focused on behaviors. And so you can see some of those listed here. The second one is the focus on sexual harassment. And obviously, this is very much related to the notion of power. It is both a legal element as well as an interpersonal element. Anybody involved in anything related to human resources knows that they have had to be very familiar with laws regarding sexual harassment and different definitions of that. Definitely recommend you explore the link there to look at the governmental legal definition of sexual harassment. So hostile environment and quid pro quo are the 2 main forms, and it'd be good for you to be familiar with those. Hostile environment has something to do, if you work in a place and your boss has a calendar on the wall that's, a pinups, does that create a tension environment for you? That's what the idea of a hostile environment predominantly works. If you're in a place where there's a lot of coarse joking, a lot of sexual innuendo to things that are said, it creates an environment that is very difficult. Obviously, many of these issues are fairly common, more common to those operating from a place of religious convictions to walk a certain path in your environment that doesn't have those convictions. And so a hostile environment is not something uncommon. Undoubtedly, it's something many of you have encountered. Quid pro quo is basically this notion of, so you want to raise, huh? Well, what are you willing to do for it? And so scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, that kind of argument. The third element, a way to look at sexuality within the organization is in terms of this resistant or emancipatory form of expression, and that has a lot to do with this notion of this revolution. And nowadays, a lot of the emphasis within this is about homosexuality and that particular movement. So this notion of heteronormativity has a lot to do with what the socially established norms have been in society historically, and deviation from those long-held norms of what has been common. The deviation from that is what characterized as difference and has led to a lot of discrimination. This notion of passing is the idea of what people who are outside the mainstream, from a sexuality point of view, what are the typical behaviors that they engage in order to pass as a normal heterosexual, so that they don't get unwanted or unwelcome attention. And some of those particular behaviors are listed here, and they're all defined in the chapter. So it's important to understand this and to wrestle with it in terms of your own spiritual convictions, but to understand it from a legal point of view in terms of discrimination issues, and understand what the laws are, and find your place of understanding. Okay, so here you have again that emphasis on that word I gave you. So I think that's it. I'm going to keep this one a little bit shorter than the last one, so we'll stop there.